this is Mr. Peterson. This screencast is about natural selection, the big idea. And maybe this is the best biological thought ever. Some scientists, some people might argue that, but to me it's a pretty big idea for biology, natural selection. And what it does is it helps explain how evolution happens. So natural selection drives evolution. And so this screencast is about the mechanisms of natural selection. So again, here's Darwin's idea, common ancestor, everything comes from there. Figures that out kind of over a period of a long time after his trip on the Beagle in the 1830s, finally publishes the book, The Origin of Species in 1859. Still one of the biggest sellers of all time because it really, he nailed it. It's, again, maybe the best biological thought ever. So this screencast is about natural selection. So he had some key insights that led to his big idea of how natural selection drives evolution. And some of it was just from his own experience as a person in Victorian England, taking a look at all the different varieties of plants and animals that we've domesticated. In other words, we've turned them into something we can eat, we can gain profit from. So for example, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, kale, kohlrabi, all those basically come from the same plant. They all come from some ancestral mustard plant, some brassica, that's the genus name. And so all of those have been selected for different parts, for the buds, for the leaves, for the roots, or the stems and flowers. But it all comes from the same plant. And he knew that from his own history, from his own gardening experience. He also raised pigeons. And so he knew that you could selectively breed for different traits within pigeons. Just like, there are different varieties of dogs, there are different varieties of pigeons. They're all related, but they've all been selectively bred for. So he's got this in the back of his head while he's starting to look at nature. If that can happen, domestically, why not in nature? So natural selection starts with the idea there has to be variation within a population. And there's some adaptation that's going to allow organisms to survive. So whatever that adaptation is, that's kind of what natural selection does. Nature selects which adaptation survives. If they survive, they reproduce. They're able to compete, perhaps better. Perhaps they've got, who knows, sharper claws, better eyes, better camouflage. Who knows, whatever it happens to be. They taste worse. So if you're a plant, you don't taste good. That'd be an adaptation, helps you survive. And then eventually you outcompete to the point where your population could become the dominant species of whatever that happens to be. So let's take a look at a couple of stories. Back in the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution kicked into play, we started burning a lot of fossil fuels. And the fossil fuel that was primarily burned in the 19th century was coal. Well, coal is pretty dirty. Lots of soot. And so in Victorian England, some scientists noticed that there were some changes in population of moths. So the dominant species of moths at that time in the 1830s was a white variety, kind of they're called peppered moths. And so it was very light colored, and the bark that the moths resided on, the camouflage was great. But all of a sudden we changed the background because of soot, and what happens? Well, now these moths are an easy target. So there's pretty good evidence that the population shift occurred. Part of the influence had to do with pollution. And so now the background has changed. Predators can see the white moths easier, so the white moths die out, and the population changes. So here's a picture of moths in their natural habitat. So you can see on the right is the peppered moth, the white variety, and then there's the dark moth. Now that has to already be in the population, though. That's one of Darwin's points, is there has to be variation within that population. So we start out in the 1830s, 1840s, and about 2% of the variety of moths, scientists estimate, were the dark variety. So 98% were the white variety. Well, Industrial Revolution goes on. the trees become darker, the white moss having a hard time, and pretty soon the dominant species is 98% dark, or the dominant variety is 98% dark. Now, since we've kind of cleaned things up, those populations have reversed themselves. So we're back to that other white variety, lighter color variety of moth. All right, so what about today? So here's a soybean field. So if you drive out in the country, well, most of the soybeans, well, whatever. Soybeans all over the place. We use it for animal feed. We make oil out of it, whatever. So one of the things that soybeans have are weeds. So here's some Canadian thistles. Canadian thistles are an invasive species. You've probably seen thistles. They hurt. They're purple. The flowers are kind of pretty, but they're an invasive species, and we don't want them in our field. So what do? Well, we spray them, right? All right. What does that do? Well, that kills them, right? So most crops these days are what we call Roundup ready. So we spray them with this chemical Roundup. The actual chemical's name is glyphosate. Well, what that does is it kills the plants and leaves nothing but the soybeans, right? Perfect. Oh, but wait, some survive. So what about these soybeans, or what about these thistles that are left? They're now immune. And so the only way you can kill those, you can't kill them with a chemical anymore. You can't kill them with a Roundup or the chemical glyphosate anymore. You got to go in and pick them. So these guys have now survived. So within that population of thistles, there was already an adaptation within the variations. It survived. It's going to be able to reproduce now because they have the ability to fight off the Roundup. They're going to outcompete the other ones, and the population is going to become the dominant one. So by making these chemical, making our crops resistant to the Roundup, we've also enhanced the weed populations as well. So evolution going on right now in your backyard, literally. All right. Natural selection has some requirements. Number one, you have to have variation within a population. So here are Darwin's finches. So Darwin studied finches in the Galapagos. They came from a common ancestor and then radiated outward. So within there had to be a variation of beaks, probably to begin with, to be selected for. They couldn't all have been the same. So just slight variations, and then over time they were selected for, and again fit into the various ecosystems on the various islands of the Galapagos. So there had to be variation within the population of finches. All right, so sometimes organisms over-reproduce, and we've all seen these. Oh, those cute little baby turtles. They just hatch. They're climbing out of the sand. They're trying to make it to the ocean, and what happens? That's right. Skuas come along and seagulls, and they eat them up. Well, so some of them, they don't all make it. So over-reproduction ensures that some do. So natural selection will happen then. So some of those ones that were eaten, sorry, their genes are gone. They have been selected against. They weren't fast enough. They couldn't dodge the gulls well enough for whatever reason. They're gull food. They're gone. So over-reproduction ensures that some will survive that way. All right. What are adaptations? Hopefully, you've been able to see hummingbirds and their long beak so that they can reach way down into the flowers to get the nectar that they're going to need to survive. So adaptations have allowed organisms, in all organisms, we can point to adaptations in all organisms that allow them to survive in their environment. So natural selection will allow those adaptations to continue on and survive. And finally, the population is going to change, right? So initially, the population was mostly the light variety of peppered moths. Soot happens, pollution happens, and over a period of time, the population changes. There's some direction to that bell curve. All of a sudden, the dominant species at the end of the 19th century, when there's lots and lots of coal soot all over the trees, is the dark variety. There's still some of the white variety out there, right? There's still going to be that variability. And so hopefully, at the end of the coal age, that population will shift back. And there's been pretty good research to that. So the best biological idea, Darwin and natural selection, and how it drives evolution. Hope that helps.